They kicked my dog in the middle of a robbery. They didn't know I used to command Army Rangers, and they definitely didn't know that dog had already survived worse than 3 men with guns. I watched Eddie Rusk's boot connect with RERS's ribs, watched my old partner go down hard against the linoleum, and something in me that I'd spent years learning to control finally stopped asking permission. I set my coffee cup down without a sound. I looked at my watch, and I started counting to 4. My name is Morgan Ellis, and this is the day 3 men walked into a diner in Cedar Falls, Virginia, and mistook a quiet woman in the corner booth for someone they could push around. I hadn't been back to this town in almost 10 years. The drive down from Fort Bragg took me through hills that still look the way they did when I was a kid. Tobacco barns leaning at the same tired angles, the same church steeple poking up over the tree and just past the county line sign. I'd finished a hard rotation overseas and taken leave to deal with my father's house, the one he'd left me when his heart finally gave out last spring. I told myself I was just there to sort through boxes and sign some papers. I didn't expect the town to need me for anything else. Doyle's Diner sat on Main Street, exactly where I remembered it, the neon sign buzzing the same tired blue, the red vinyl booths cracked in the same places. My father used to bring me here every Sunday after church back when I was young enough to think pancakes were the best reward the world had to offer. Walking in that morning felt like stepping into a memory that hadn't aged the way I had. The coffee still smelled burnt in that comforting way. The old jukebox by the window still had a piece of tape over the coin slot. I picked the corner booth out of habit more than sentiment. It's a habit I never unlearned. The kind that gets built into you after enough years in uniform. Always know where the exits are. Always have a clean line of sight to the door, the kitchen, the parking lot. Nobody in that diner had any idea I'd spent the better part of 2 decades leading soldiers through some of the ugliest places on earth. To them, I was just a woman in a canvas jacket and jeans, tired from a long drive, sharing her booth with a big German shepherd who lay down at her feet like he'd done it 1,000 times before, because he had. Ranger was 8 years old, a military working dog who'd washed out of active service after an IED took part of the hearing in his left ear and left a scar along his shoulder that never fully grew fur back. He'd earned that scar getting me and 3 of my men out of a compound outside Kandahar that was rigged to come down around us. The Army retired him with honors. I adopted him before anyone else could. He wasn't a pet to me. He was the closest thing I had left to the men I used to serve with, most of whom weren't around anymore, to remind me why I do things the way I do. Frank Doyle spotted me before I'd even taken my jacket off. He came around the counter slow the way men do when their knees have given them trouble for a decade, and he looked at me like he was looking at a ghost wearing a familiar face. "You've got your daddy's eyes," he said. And just like that, we were talking about my father about the winter. Frank almost lost this place to the bank, and my dad co-signed a loan nobody in his right mind should have co-signed. Frank never forgot it. I could tell by the way his voice caught when he said it. A young waitress named Emily Carter brought me a menu and a bowl of water for Ranger without being asked. She couldn't have been older than 17, ponytail pulled back tight. The kind of tired in her eyes that comes from working 2 jobs when you're saving for nursing school instead of prom dresses. She scratched behind Rears's ears and told me he had kind eyes. I told her he'd earned every gray hair on that muzzle. Underneath the easy conversation, though, something in the diner felt off. Frank kept glancing toward the parking lot every few minutes, quick little looks he probably didn't realize he was making. When I asked him about it, he brushed it off. Said a few businesses in town had run into some trouble lately. Vandalism, break-ins, nothing worth worrying a customer over. But I've spent too many years reading the body language of men trying not to look scared. Frank Doyle was scared. I noticed the envelope by the register almost by accident. Gray paper sealed with a small black symbol stamped in the corner that looked like a crow with its wings spread. The moment Frank saw me looking, he swept it off the counter and into a drawer so fast his coffee pot nearly tipped. I didn't ask. Some instinct told me I didn't need to yet. The diner stayed warm and easy for another 20 minutes, the kind of ordinary morning most people never think twice about. Then a black pickup with no plates rolled into the lot and stopped crooked across 2 parking spaces and 3 men in ski masks stepped out with guns already in their hands. I set my coffee cup down. Ranger lifted his head. I said one word low enough that only he could hear it. "Stay." The first shot went into the ceiling before anyone had time to scream properly. Plaster dust drifted down over the counter like snow. And for a second, the whole diner just froze, forks halfway to mouths, coffee cups suspended in midair. Then the screaming started for real, and the man who'd fired the shot started shouting for everybody to get down on the floor. I want to be clear about something. In that first instant, I wasn't thinking about being a hero. I was thinking about angles, about who had eyes on the door, about where the nearest cover was for Emily, and the older couple by the window, and the cook I could hear frozen behind the pass-through window. 20 years of training doesn't turn off just because you're wearing jeans instead of a uniform. It just goes quiet waiting. 3 men all in dark clothes and ski masks. 2 handguns and a pump shotgun. The one holding the shotgun was clearly running the show broader through the shoulders, moving with the kind of controlled aggression that told me he'd done this before, or something close to it. I'd learned later his name was Calvin Rusk, the younger one who locked the front door and started grabbing phones off tables. Moved, twitchy, excited, like this was still a game to him. That was Troy, and the third leaner, meaner, looking even under the mask, kept circling toward my side of the room. That was Eddie Calvin's younger brother, and he had the eyes of a man who enjoyed the fear he caused more than the money he was after. I raised my hand slow, the universal signal of a woman with no interest in trouble. I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I just watched, and within 30 seconds, I knew something was wrong with this whole picture. Robbers looking for cash, empty registers and run. Calvin wasn't interested in the register. He walked straight past it toward Frank, grabbed him by the collar of his apron, and demanded the gray envelope. He wanted Frank to sign something, a transfer, ownership papers. Frank said no. Calvin backhanded him across the face hard enough to split his lip, and Frank went down against the counter, blood already welling at the corner of his mouth. Emily screamed and lunged toward him, and Troy grabbed her by the arm and yanked her back so hard I heard her shoulder pop out of alignment for a second before it settled again. Her hands were shaking so badly I could see it from across the room. That's when Ranger growled low in his chest, a sound I'd only ever heard him make twice before. Both times, right before something very bad happened to someone who deserved it, Eddie noticed. He turned toward our booth, looked down at Ranger with something between amusement and contempt, and laughed under his mask. He asked me, what kind of woman brings an old dog to a diner robbery? Like Ranger was a joke. Like the scars on that animal's shoulder were something to mock instead of something earned. He told me to push the dog out into the aisle where he could keep an eye on him. I told him calm as I could manage that Ranger wouldn't cause a problem as long as nobody hurt anybody in this room. Eddie's boot came out of nowhere fast, me aimed square at RER's ribs. I heard the impact before I processed it. A dull, heavy sound and then Rears's yelp, sharp and pained as he rolled onto his side. Something in my chest went white hot and absolutely silent at the same time. I've felt rage before, real rage on nights I don't talk about with people who haven't worn the uniform. But this was different. This was personal in a way that surprised even me. I checked Ranger with my eyes without moving my head. Watched his ribs rise and fall. Watched him blink up at me. Still alert, still present, bruised, not broken. I filed that information away and kept my face as still as a closed door. Eddie laughed again, told the room that the scared old lady with the geriatric guard dog wasn't going to be a problem for anybody. Calvin, meanwhile, had Frank by the collar again, demanding the safe combination. When Frank hesitated, Calvin raised his shotgun and pointed it at Emily. Instead, told Frank he had 5 seconds before the girl learned what happens to people who get in the way. I started doing the math I've done 100 times in far worse rooms than this one. Calvin stood roughly 10 feet from me, his finger resting outside the trigger guard, sloppy positioning for a man supposedly comfortable with a gun. Troy had gone quiet, distracted, thumbing through a fan of cash he'd pulled from someone's wallet. Eddie stood far too close to my booth gun, angled carelessly to the side, close enough that I could smell the cheap laundry detergent on his jacket. I reached up slowly and unclipped my watch. Set it on the table without a sound. The way you'd set down anything you didn't want damaged in the next few seconds. I looked at Ranger. 4, I said quietly. It was a word from another life. Another set of rooms far more dangerous than this one. A command we drilled into muscle memory back when we still wore the same patch. It meant a coordinated strike. 4 breaths from now. No hesitation, no second thoughts. None of the 3 men understood what they just heard. Why would they? To them, it probably sounded like the confused mumbling of a frightened woman talking to her dog. I started counting in my head, steady, unhurried, the way I'd counted before doors got kicked in and rooms got cleared, and men who meant harm to people I loved got exactly what they came looking for. 1 2 3 4. The moment I hit 4 in my head, I moved. I drove my knee up into the underside of the table and shoved it hard into Eddie's legs, catching him off balance right as his gun hand swung wide. His shot went into the ceiling tiles instead of anywhere near me. Before he could recover, I had his wrist locked in both hands, twisting it the way I'd been taught to twist a wrist 1,000 times over until the joint had nowhere left to go but wrong. The gun clattered to the floor, and I kicked it under the booth, out of reach, out of the fight. At the exact same second, Ranger came off the ground like he hadn't just taken a boot to the ribs 30 seconds earlier. He didn't lunge wild, he didn't bite blind, he went straight for Troy's gun arm and locked his jaw exactly where he'd been trained to lock it years ago, high on the forearm.